Welcome back to the Women in AV podcast. I'm your host, Erica Carroll, and today we are diving into another inspiring story of a woman that is breaking barriers in the world, not necessarily in AV, although a little bit adjacent, and I love the way that she's been working with us. Welcome, Brittany. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Great. I'm so excited to have you on here. Now, Brittany Greer is an absolute powerhouse. Now, I've known Brittany for a few years because of the work that we've been doing with Rosie Riveters. So I actually want to kick it off there. Why don't you tell us, what do you do? What is Rosie Riveters? What's your mission?
Yeah, absolutely. So Rosie Riveters is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. I'm the executive director. And I'm also the founder. So I started it way back in 2016. And what we do every day is work to engage and inspire more girls into STEM careers: science, technology, engineering, and math. For all those who are not familiar, 28% of the STEM workforce is female and 5% of it are women of color. And we're really focused in the field of bringing more women into those fields, workforce development conversations, so that we have complex workforces who can come together and create innovations for what tomorrow might look like. And the more kind of different representation of that we have in our ecosystems, the better. And so we work on targeted programs to provide engagement opportunities that aren't otherwise available in a lot of the spaces where girls are engaging.
And one of those ways that you engage is through industry. And we are so lucky to have this partnership between Rosie Riveters and the AV industry in general, connecting a lot of those STEM projects that y'all work with, in translating it into how that applies to AV, so that these kids do get that hands-on experience with something AV related, and starting to garner that interest.
Absolutely. I mean, when we through Rosie and myself, when we look through the lens of workforce development, a lot of the conversations are awareness of where you can apply skill sets. And so many kids are surrounded by incredible organizations, Pro AV, the whole breadth of STEM, where they could go and apply their skills and do amazing things, but they don't know that they're there, right? And so we work a lot with industry to talk to kids starting at 4 all the way through 18, right? About like who's in their backyard, what does that job mean? And more, even like as important to that conversation, like what resources and conversations are out there and are happening that they can access to pipeline into those fields. The talent's sitting in the industry's backyard. It's just making the connections so that those kids can access those opportunities.
Absolutely. So I want to learn a little bit about you and how you got to where you are. I know that you were across the pond when all of this sort of started and sparked for you. Can you tell us a little bit about your history?
So my background is in communications. I worked in the political world. I worked in corporate communications. I hawked Puma shoes for a while just to influencers, right? It was a whole kind of breath. But before I started Rosie, the kind of most recent application of that was I was recruited into an organization called the World Association of Nuclear Operators. And essentially, every operating nuclear power plant in the world is a member, and they operate under a confidentiality agreement to improve safety, right? And one of the things we were looking at that time, we were doing external work and internal work in terms of communications, but the big focus was around safety culture, right? How did you provide a space where people were comfortable to report problems when they were tiny before they became big? And how did that look like across cultures, right? So World Association, right? So you have everything from Atlanta to Tokyo to Moscow and in between. And one of the first things you do in a comms role is look at your audience and who you're talking to. And so I pulled our data set, and I looked at it, and I looked at it again, and to my surprise at that time, it wasn't something that I had been deeply involved in it before then. The population that was employed was effectively the same person, just in a different country, right? So you had a little bit of a shift of like where they were in the world, but they were for the most part the same person, similar education background, all of those things, and predominantly male. And so I went to my boss at the time, our managing director, and I said, look, I can have a conversation with this audience, right, about culture, and we can frame that. I said, but if we really want to shift culture, we got to mix it up a bit. Right? We got to look at where we have different inputs and viewpoints and all of those things. And so my managing director at the time said to me, we'll go out and talk to women who are nuclear engineers, find out why we don't have more of them, and kind of go on this data dive. And I did that. And I went all over the world, and I went from Paris to Moscow to Atlanta and London. I was working out of London at the time. And I talked to women who were nuclear engineers and got immersed in the dialogue around what's called the STEM pipeline. So if you're listening to this, that had big old air quotes on it, right? I'm a big believer in pathways, but people like pipelines, right? And the real focus of the conversation there was that in terms of kind of women's trajectory into these fields, there was this big loss of engagement that happened at middle school. And at the time, the interventions that were available there were really focused on intervening at that problem point, right? And from my perspective, I was looking at through, well, why are you losing them in middle school? What's causing the problem to happen in the first place? And so I went on this big data dive to find out kind of what information I could find. And what stuck out to me was a couple of key pieces of data. So girls are academically ahead overall in elementary school compared to their male counterparts. Girls' confidence drops by about 30% between the ages of 8 and 11. And then there's some pretty hefty research on girls who are identified as gifted and talented and their relationship to learning things that they don't kind of quickly have an understanding of, right? They kind of move away when they don't immediately understand it. And so I kind of took all 3 points of that data and went, well, if girls overall are academically ahead, what does that mean for their experience in elementary school in terms of being challenged to build the confidence to do stuff that they don't kind of innately get? And that was the real kind of driver. I had, and then in this time I had a baby and my family relocated to the US. It was pre-COVID. I loved my company loved me, but it was not the age of working in America with a team in London, especially with a bunch of an older population where that just wasn't their comfort zone. And that was, it was a different world in terms of remote work. But I had a year's worth of maternity leave because I was London based, even when I gave my notice 6 months into it. And so I kind of had this 6-month window to decide what I was going to do. And so I built an initial curriculum that really focused on providing what we call a productive struggle. So a space for girls to get things wrong before they get them right, kind of nudge them out of their comfort zones. And this is applicable to everybody, but really focus on the fact that this is not something that girls actively necessarily get in early elementary and kind of large opportunities. And I was in the library a lot with my then, going into this now, right, my then 3-month-old, as we're in 3 months into the process of this thing. And I was really struck by the fact that there were a lot of young parents, and then there was a lot of retirees, and there wasn't much in the middle. And libraries were kind of just dipping their toe in this conversation around maker spaces, but the librarians were not makers. I mean, some of them were crafty, right? But they weren't using 3D printers at the time.
Right.
A lot more are now. And so I put together this curriculum. I put it out to a mom's group, which like a listserv, basically, and said, I need a bunch of teachers to come to me and tell me if this is completely not worth anybody's time. And if it is, that's okay. I'll go continue doing my comm stuff. And so I brought about 12 teachers. I made them lunch. I gave them copies of the curriculum. And I said, what do you think? And I also brought in industry. So I'm in Northern Virginia, and I'm surrounded by incredible STEM-based organizations. And so I had engineers and doctors and kinds of all different people. And the feedback that we got at that time was, this is everything we want to do. We don't have the resources to do it in our classrooms. And I can definitely talk about where we've solved those in the interim. But long story short, the same listserv, I told people what I wanted to do. I live in Northern Virginia. It's a very well-connected community. Somebody came back and said, I have a family foundation. Can I support your first program? And I said, yes. And that was the beginning of Rosie Riveters. And we've served over 35,000 kids to date since 2016 from Orlando to Alaska. So
that's amazing. So I know that you probably had a lot of people that you looked up to and people nudging you along the way, also not just with Rosie, but also in your career. And I also know that this is something that you do build into Rosie's Innovate program, which is for the older kids. But what does mentorship, what has that looked like for you in your career and helped you get to where you are?
Yeah, I mean, Rosie exists today because of the boss I had at Wano, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had a boss in a mentor role who fundamentally believed in the truth, I would argue, that
Mm-hmm.
you are as good as your team is, right? And so your team doing even overperforming you, it's not a bad thing, right? It means your team
Right.
is performing the way that it needs to. And she was
Yeah.
very influential in kind of giving me the confidence to move into spaces that, at 22, 23, right? I was a little hesitant to walk into, right? But had
Mm-hmm.
something to say, and she had seen it in that application. And that's something I do a lot with the women that the people, quite frankly, that I work with, right? When you see potential, about finding access in those points and mentoring that opportunity. And so, the conversation about like for even the zeitgeist of Rosie Riveters starting was because I wound up in a boardroom with, CEOs of nuclear power plants across the world to talk to them about
Mm-hmm.
these issues. And was, it all worked and they listened and it was productive and we did well and how to adapt to that. But I wouldn't have been in that space or found the opportunity to be in that space if I hadn't had that mentor boss person working with me going, no, you should be here. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
that almost kind of imposter syndrome's talked about a lot, right? Just the space, the confidence to make the first step into a space, right? And be able to then have the validation to further your confidence has been really influenced by the mentors and the people around me kind of championing that, like reinforcing, right, that you can move into these spaces and that you do have something to say, and then being
Mm-hmm.
sure that in kind of networks that I operate within to do that as well. I write a lot of recommendation letters, right, for people I've worked with because it's the least I can
Right.
do, right, in terms of connecting, so that people can find their space to kind of grow and do what they need to do. So I think
Yeah.
it's huge, but it's all different by who you're connecting with. And I think mentors can come in a lot of different forms, but my boss at Wano, Claire Newell. Shout out to Claire. She's amazing. I highly recommend her if you want to work with her, but she's in the UK, so maybe one
That's funny. So, if I were brand new coming into STEM field, or maybe I'm just interested in STEM in general, maybe it's AV, maybe not. What kind of advice would you give to me as, you know, 30 something year old who's looking to maybe utilize more of my potential?
I would say nothing is too late, right? When you talk about mentors and role models and all those things, I go back to the fact, that Madeleine Albright was 45 before she ever had a real job. Right, and went on to become
Hmm.
Secretary of State. It's the same thing with STEM. People talk about upskilling. There's so many certifications out there, so many
Hmm.
pathways into these fields. We've got nearly 3.5 million of a shortage of STEM employees. I promise
Hmm.
you, there are resources to help you access that space, regardless of kind
Yeah.
of what it is. I think that kind of having an exploration of what is your peak interest, right? Are you really into research? Do you like to use your hands? Are you a building person? Do
Hmm.
you not really want to hang out with people on a day-to-day basis and want to just work from home and code like crazy? There's also communal coding
Yeah.
opportunities, but there's really kind of the beauty of working in science, technology, engineering, and math is I would say it's applicable to kind of any field you're walking into now in any role,
Hmm.
whether it's even comms and utilizing AI to, expedite your process or whatever that is. But the
Right.
thing I would more importantly say is there are absolutely pathways into almost everything that you would want to do. And a lot of them are a lot shorter in terms of timeline than you might think they would be.
Hmm.
And if I'm talking literally to the rooted idea that you do not have to be an expert or innately good at it to start,
Hmm.
just start. And as you do it, you will build your confidence in it, right? And you will find more of those connections.
Hmm.
And I am very much a person, you and I've talked about this a lot, right? I utilize AI a lot. Don't be afraid to go and talk to your chat GPT about like your interest points and where you might want us to get started. Definitely fact check it. It's
Absolutely.
still working and making itself better, right? But there's a lot of great ways that it can kind of outline those first steps for you. But the short answer is that there's a plethora of opportunities and pathways. And with 3.5 million shortages of jobs unfilled,
Hmm.
like nearly 2 million of those because people are unqualified.
Yeah.
You can get qualified. I promise you there's a program and a resource out there for you. They're just not always great at communicating that they're available. But if you dig, you
Yeah.
can find them.
Typically, my next question is about like your intrinsic motivation and what are you passionate about and what's your why? But I feel like we've covered a lot of that. So I would like to ask you about the future
Okay.
and what you see for the future in STEM, not just for women, but also technology, because you mentioned AI.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any thoughts on what that might look like in the future?
I think the more and more work that we do to bring more people who have previously not been at the table within these spaces, the opportunity for innovation and creation is huge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even down, because most often than not, you're going to make something that's going to solve your problem. So your unique viewpoint is brought into a conversation or a space is where we get a plethora of ideas and insight into individual need, right? If I make something
Mm-hmm.
that just works for me and then I want to put that product out to market for the masses, I might be able to appeal to me or deliver to me, right? But I'm not necessarily getting that delivered to everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I see in the future as we bring in more women and people from different backgrounds and communities and globally into these spaces is that you have the opportunity for new ideas to come into that. And with that, exciting new outputs as a
Mm-hmm.
result. And for me, that's the essence of STEM, right?
Yeah.
I'll give a really quick example of what I mean by that. So I had a young woman in our programs who is identified when she signed up that she was on the autistic spectrum. We did a project where we made kinetic butterflies, right? Or my version was a butterfly. And
Mm-hmm.
essentially, you wind it up, you put it in a book, it flies out, right? And it's kinetic versus potential energy. But in
Mm-hmm.
our classes, they have this kind of open-ended time to build, and they just have a completed example, not step-by-step instructions. And she totally innovated her approach. So instead of it going like a horizontally like a butterfly, it flew
Mm-hmm.
out vertically like a helicopter.
Okay.
And it flew like crazy. Like it was wild how much better of a design it was than my design. I'm an enthusiastic person. I mildly freaked out. I was like, this is amazing. You have to tell everybody about what you did. I'm so impressed. And she looked me dead in the face and said, I don't talk in front of people. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
okay. Now, don't get me wrong. I had to definitely I clearly talk in front of people. So I had to brace myself and process through that. I said
Yeah.
to her, look, okay, how about two different options? So, and you don't take either of them, but I'm going to throw them out there just to see where they might land. One is you tell me about your process and I'll share with the group about what you did and obviously credit you because it's yours and you're here. I said, or B,
Mm-hmm.
if you want, you can talk from the back of the classroom and I'll show your project up from the front. And she opted for option B. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't like Rosie's great. The coolest part of it, right, was that she gave all of her insights and why she approached the project differently. The rest of the participants in the classroom asked her tons of questions,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody cared that she spoke from the back of the classroom.
Right.
Right? Nobody cared at all. Nobody questioned it. Nobody didn't ask questions. The voice
Yep.
was just coming from a different space.
Yep.
And she walked out and said to me when she was leaving, that was really cool. I don't usually get to use my voice as I walk into these spaces.
Mm.
And now when she has to present at school, she asks to present from the back. Right. And so it's this little tweak, but I cannot emphasize enough how much cooler hers was than mine and how much more effective it was at the objective, right? It flew way higher. But if there wasn't the space to kind of bring her in and add that and have that kind of shakeup of the norm, definitely different from my norm, right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't have gotten it. And so that's what I see with the future of STEM, right? Is when you bring in these spaces and you bring in these conversations, and then there were innovations based on her design, right? So somebody turned theirs into I can't remember what was it, like a dragonfly thing, because it's what she did, and it was really cool. And so I'm excited for that. And as we talk about the use of tools and data and things of the more we have robust inputs into those data sets, the better
Mm-hmm.
outputs we're going to get, right? I talk
Yep.
about the way that I use AI to optimize myself all the time. I don't necessarily want my 11-year-old writing her papers with AI because I want her to know how to structure a paper. But if she wants
Right.
to leverage that tool later on, 150%. But
Yep.
it's only as good as the input. I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the reality of all of this. Inputs equal outputs. And so
Yep.
when we have more robust inputs, I'm excited for the future of those outputs. And so that's kind of where I see the space going is I'm excited for what's next by being
Yeah.
able to bring more people into the space.
I completely agree. And I use AI on a daily basis, and different modes of AI depending on what I'm trying to accomplish because different ones are good at different things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's only going to get better. Same thing. The more information that goes into it, the more people that adopt it, I think will make a more well-rounded workforce even because they're able to process through things more efficiently or get into, a version 0.0 so much faster,
Yeah. I
you
mean, I'm
know?
dyslexic. The ability for
Yeah.
me to not have the spelling errors that are my norm,
Hmm.
amazing. Right? Like I used to open up presentations
Yeah.
it's a reality of me. It doesn't I don't have an issue with the fact that I'm dyslexic, right? So I often would
Yeah.
go into a meeting and say, look, we had a really tight deadline of this. I put together this presentation. I promise you it's going to be rich and interesting. If you see a
Mhm.
typo, raise your hand and I'll fix it. But I'm dyslexic
Yeah.
and I might mess it up. Right. But utilizing tools like AI
So
absolutely make those things faster and more efficient. But I use the word tool like
it's a
really
tool.
specifically. And if
Absolutely.
you don't know how to, it's still your, at the moment, right? It's still very much your vision and how you're utilizing it. So the same way of like getting a certification to upskill yourself or giving it the first try to how to use it, it's an exercise of how to use that tool effectively, right? First time you ride a bike, you probably fall off of it. After you ride it for a while, you can bob and weave or do whatever you want. I never did that. I'm really bad on a hill, but everybody has their own process, so it's fine. Like,
Awesome. So we're nearing the end of the program here. So what are you reading or listening to, or what have you learned recently that is worth sharing? Something interesting.
yeah, so I'm reading a lot of things. I think a lot of people in the world are right now. There's a lot of content going through my brain. So to help me process all of that, I actually started doing hand embroidery. Mainly because I saw it on my Instagram feed and somebody embroidered their stationery. I was like, I can do that. So I bought a kit on Amazon, and I embroidered my first flower. And it's been a great way to just kind of, I'm always looking at ways that I can, learn something new every day, ideally. And so embroidery,
What did you put the flower on? Or was it just a hoop?
it's not an embroidery hoop. But my next step is I'm going to put it on stationery.
Okay.
And I might even make some like Rosie Riveters stationery and be really proud. So step by step, we'll get there in the end.
That's amazing. I I love using the creative side of my brain to definitely, not just help to wind down whatever it is I'm thinking, but also to process all of the other stuff that's going on through the day.
100%.
And I've been so I have reading comprehension issues, so I listen to books, and I say that all the time. Listening is just like reading; we can still do a book report. Fight me on
An
that.
input equals an output. Yep.
Yeah. I've been listening to the book Why We Sleep,
Okay.
which, by the way, is a 14-hour book and absolutely fascinating. But a minute ago, you brought up riding a bike, and they talk about like how learning is cemented in your brain when you sleep,
Mhm.
and that versus the idea of muscle memory, and it's not actually muscle memory when you're riding a bike. It's brain memory, but it's done through repetition. And one thing that I found fascinating was they told this case study of this guy who plays the piano, and he would have these like long sessions. And then at the end of the day, he'd be trying to play a particular part and he would just get it wrong. And then he'd go to sleep and he wakes up and he can just play like nothing ever happened. And part of that is the memory storage in his brain was solidifying that quote unquote muscle memory of that repetitive task, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So
it is. I mean, the power of, you talk about the future too, the amount of our brain that we haven't unlocked or utilized is a whole nother conversation.
100%.
I actually just finished the book called Ouch, which is about the science of pain, right? And so how much of it is mental versus physical and how it manifests in different people. And it's all rooted in what the argument that she presents is all rooted in that conversation as well. And I'll have one other thing that I'll leave you with, which is a book that I always recommend if you have not read it, which is the book called Invisible Women. And it's all around data. And it's all around data representation and research, and the kind of effects of that representation and research. So everything from the fact that, speaking of AV, my Alexa doesn't listen to me as well as my husband because the data input for voice recognition is 70% male. So when I speak to it in a lower voice, it listens to me. So again, maybe I sound like a broken record, but inputs equal outputs, because if you had more representation of a higher registered voice, I would not be often yelling at my internal home AIs, because that's usually where I find myself. And who knows what that does to my blood pressure? I don't think it can't be good, right? Like, it cannot be a good thing.
Okay, so finally, we have a tradition on the show where the previous guest asks a question for the next guest, not knowing who it might be. So the question for you is, what is something that you have done for yourself that made you happy?
I just planned a girls' trip with my
exciting.
Best friends. And I usually always prioritize my family and my family's travel, which, full disclosure, is my happy place, right? I really like that. But deciding that we were going to go and kind of do this together is something we've been talking about for years, and it's finally actually happening. And so I was really happy to do it, even though all of my micromanaging came out and there's literally like a color coordinated itinerary, but that's okay. We'll live our lives and I'll find my creative happiness and it'll be great.
That's hilarious. So where are you going, if you don't mind my asking? What are you
doing?
We're
going to New York. We're taking the train up. I'm in DC, Northern Virginia. So we're just going up for the long weekend. We're going in September. I mean, it's really far away, but I got a Google map. It's coded. It's very cute. There's a color theme. I might have made luggage tags. Like, it's a whole thing. Maybe I'll embroider them. You never know.
Cool. I'm excited for you. That's very cool.
Thanks. You can come if you want to.
Yeah, I'll let you know. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story on this episode of the Women in AV podcast. It's been such a pleasure having you, sharing your insights and your experiences. Brittany, where can people find you?
So rosieriveters.org is where we live and exist. And we're all, LinkedIn is a great place to find our latest updates, and Instagram. All just at Rosie Riveters and all of those places. And you can find direct links to those on rosieriveters.org if that makes your life easier, because sometimes the algorithm doesn't like to find people.
Yeah. You can also just find you on LinkedIn too, Brittany Greer.
I'm there too. Yep. I'm in all the places. My Instagram is private, but if you really want to request me, you can. It's not exciting. It's not pictures of my kid in her Halloween costume. But I am definitely on LinkedIn. And you can find me right through the Rosie Riveters page, but it's just Brittany Greer.
Wonderful. And you can find me in all of the social places with the handle at the Erica Carroll. Thank you again. And to all of our listeners, if you're listening to this as audio only, be sure to check out the YouTube version, and vice versa. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can also find us anywhere you get your podcasts. And remember to check out some of our other AVNation shows, like our friends over at AV Career Mastermind on avnation.tv.
The network for the AV industry. What are you listening to? This
is AV.
This is AVNation.
This is AVNation.